Thank you for coming to tonight's Borah Symposium lecture. My name is Anna Schwisow, and I'm the co-chair of the Borah Committee, along with James Fox. And first, we'd like to tell you a little about the Borah Committee. The William Edgar Borah Outlawry of War Foundation was founded at the University of Idaho in 1929 by Solomon O. Levinston to honor Senator Borah and continue his work for peace. The mission of the Borah Foundation is to explore the causes of war and conditions for peace. The mission of the Borah Foundation is fulfilled by sponsoring a yearly symposium. This year's symposium is the 61st consecutive symposium at the University of Idaho. The work of the foundation is done by a committee composed of faculty and students. This evening, the committee would like to thank the Martin Institute in particular for their support of tonight's event. This evening, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Fred Cocozzelli. Dr. Cocozzelli has field experience with reconciliation in both Guatemala and Kosovo. In Guatemala, he worked for the National Coordinating Office for Refugees and the Displaced. And in Kosovo, Dr. Cocozzelli worked with Catholic Relief Services and spent a year supervising the distribution of humanitarian relief to more than 90,000 people. He also served in Kosovo as the transition advisor from humanitarian relief to sustainable welfare. Dr. Cocozzelli later received grants to conduct field research at Kosovo, Bosnia, and Serbia. He has had several academic works published, many of which focus on Kosovo. His dog is even from Kosovo. So, Dr. Cocozzelli has a master's degree from Columbia University School of International Public Affairs and a PhD from the New School for Social Research. Dr. Cocozzelli is currently a faculty member of the Department of Government and Politics at St. John's University in New York. He teaches classes in post-conflict reconciliation and justice, and according to some online reviews, gives way too much reading. So please welcome Dr. Cocozzelli.
Great, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Borah Symposium. This is it's a bit of a surprise that I was able to make it, and I'm very excited by the project in general. It's been a great opportunity. What I'm going to speak about this evening is different than what was on the initial program, obviously. And it's about reconciliation and post-conflict justice. And in a broader sense, it's about the role of just society in achieving reconciliation and social stability. As I said, my field work was in Kosovo, and in the transition from humanitarian relief to social welfare. So what I became most deeply involved in were the actual institutions of social welfare and social policy. And I think as it emerges from the talk, you'll get a better sense about what exactly I mean by social policy and social welfare. But I'd like to put a bit more of it in context. I'd like to put specifically in context what I'm talking about in terms of post-conflict, right? I'm referring specifically to places that have been involved in violent and highly divisive conflicts. Some places this rises to the level of civil war, and other places it remains sort of at a lower level, occasionally bursting into intense violence. Generally, they're places that have seen violent confrontations between relatively well-organized armed groups that represent opposing sides of deep political and social cleavages. All right? These are places where you've really got intense divisions that have developed into strict conflicts. And these cleavages, they could be ideologically, ethnic, religious, racial, any number, right? Most often they're overlapping of all of these different divisions, right? Or variations of them. The divisions are not easily reconciled through regular political processes, right? Which is an important aspect in that they've come to be confrontations. Confrontations that feed dynamics of increasingly intense conflict that move towards greater and greater violence. But to some degree, because they're post-conflict, there's been some sort of political resolution. There is some sort of settlement. There's some sort of peace agreement, whether it is a temporary peace agreement or some sort of temporary negotiation settlement or negotiated settlement or a more long-term settlement. Right? Places like Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, Chechnya are recent examples. We can look further back to post-World War II Europe, which is a case that I'd like to refer to back throughout the talk as someplace that really idealizes this. places like Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, may be somewhat of hybrids in the sense that the conflict is not really over, but the reconstruction is ongoing. So that might be something we'll talk about in terms of the discussion session at the end. My overall goal in the presentation is to link social justice to reconciliation through the reconstruction of institutions, specifically institutions for social welfare. Ultimately, I'm going to argue that the parameters of justice in a society, essentially the measurements of how just a society is, are determined by a broad array of institutions, including social welfare institutions. Violent conflicts in general destroy or severely damage almost all of the social institutions of a given polity, whether it's a country, a region, a province like Kosovo or some other section. And so most of these need to be reconstructed in some way after a conflict. Further, I'm going to argue that the justness of these institutions determines their ability to promote broad social solidarity, what I will consider to be something of a foundation for reconciliation. Right. In doing all this, I'm going to be pulling together a bunch of different ideas and different perspectives. One is my own perspective as a political scientist, and in that perspective, I'm going to be highlighting the role of public or state institutions. Political scientists, we tend to idealize the state in some ways. We think of it as an extremely important institution, and I would maintain for good reason the state is an extremely powerful institution and one that does need to be taken into account, particularly in terms of conflict. Another perspective from myself will be that of sort of a political theorist. In that dimension, I'm going to be referencing some political theories, things like John Rawls' theory of justice, T.H. Marshall's theory of social citizenship, maybe a couple of others. For a minute, I want to digress on that. My intention in referring to Rawls, Marshall, and these other sorts of theoreticians or theoretical figures isn't to sort of gussy up the presentation into something more theoretical, but to link the situations in what we identify as zones of conflict, places like Kosovo, places like Bosnia, places that have suffered these kinds of conflicts, to link those with what we could think of as normal political thought. And my point is that the conflicts represent extraordinary situations, but they are addressable within the framework of regular political theorizing. It is the kind of thing that doesn't necessarily always need a special category. And theories about democracy that are applicable to us may also be applicable in other places. Right? And so ultimately, I would hope, for example, that you'll come away from this talk and think some of what I said about reconciliation in post-conflict societies is in fact applicable to our daily lives here in the United States, that reconstruction is in some ways an ongoing thing, even in places that seem extraordinarily stable. Right? Finally, I'll bring my own practical experience, my own perspective as a practitioner working in Kosovo. So Kosovo will be the case I refer to the most, but not always. Okay. At first glance, the reconstruction of institutions may seem a somewhat unexceptional way to approach post-conflict reconciliation. Institutional reconstruction has become sort of the modus operandi of the international community when it comes to post-conflict work. Whether it's in a multilateral forum like the UN missions, EU missions, or in a sort of ad hoc coalitional form, this is generally the business that the international community has taken in these situations. We go in looking to rewrite constitutions, restructure governments, organize elections, organize judiciary institutions, police forces, or armies. And these are really often the areas that are most addressed in talking about justice and reconciliation. Often these are conversations about identifying victims and victimizers, determining a balance between retribution and forgiveness. We debate war crimes tribunals versus truth commissions and these types of things. The institutions involved are often the institutions of justice. Again, things like the judiciary, rebuilding police forces, drawing attention to human rights practices within civilian police, all of these sorts of institutional approaches. Where I'd like to turn our attention is to the issues of social justice, right, in post-conflict reconstruction. Like I say, I'll draw from Rawls here, specifically quoting from John Rawls and his theory of justice. Our topic, however, is social justice. For us, the primary subject of justice is the basic structure of society, or more exactly, the way in which the major social institutions distribute fundamental rights and duties and determine the division of advantages from social cooperation. In focusing on the institutions of social justice, what I want to do is expand the universe of subjects for discussion in post-conflict reconciliation to include institutions that you wouldn't normally think and practices that you might not normally think of as the sphere or the subject matter of post-conflict work. And particularly things like aid to the poor, right? Institutionalized state-supported aid to the indigent, right? Pension funds, aid to the elderly, unemployment insurance, disability funds, all the sorts of social benefits that go with what we more or less consider the normal welfare state. But I believe in doing that and approaching those kinds of institutions, we'll move a little bit closer to this topic of reconciliation in general. Let me talk for a minute on social justice and the idea of a just society. Obviously, a perfectly just society, one in which social justice is fully incorporated into all aspects of society, is a human impossibility. It may seem even more of an impossibility in the wake of a violent conflict. The idea of going from deep divisions to a society that's embodied in justice would seem almost impossible. But whether it's in a stable society like our own in the United States or in a zone of conflict we can call, I believe it should serve as an idealized goal. Right? It's something to reach for, whether here or in a conflict zone and in that point of reconstruction. It may, in fact, even be more important in post-conflict reconstruction because ideas of social justice and the idea of a just society seem to contribute to stability, right, which is ultimately the goal of reconstruction in some ways. Right? Returning again to John Rawls, a society regulated by a public sense of justice is inherently stable. Right? The stability is derived from the recognition of justice by its members. Right? Recognizing the inherent justness of their own system, citizens experience a sense of satisfaction and operate within their social structures to resolve conflicts. And in that sense, there is no final resolution of conflicts, right? We all live with daily political conflicts. The idea of solving political conflicts is in some sense more impossible than a just society. But at the same time, the idea of a public sense of justice as being available as a resource to resolve ongoing conflicts makes what I would call the long series of momentary resolutions, momentary political resolutions possible that make up sort of a peaceful history. Right. But this just society suggests a very inclusive system. A system that incorporates members of the polity as a full citizen. Right? Anything less would imply sort of an exclusion. Right? A segment of polities that are lesser second-class citizens. And this type of segmented citizenship is especially relevant to conflict and conflict situations because exclusion is in many cases the core here of these kinds of conflicts. Exclusion based on ethnic, religious, racial, ideological, or other identities are often the key role in the polarization of the population that goes through a conflict. So achieving a broad post-conflict resolution avoids the pitfalls of social stratification, which then leads towards polarization. In other words, working towards social justice is the content of post-conflict reconciliation. Sort of the flip side of this, of course, is social injustice. And at the core of social injustice, I would argue, lies exclusion. Right? And that you can argue violent civil conflict can even be seen as a dramatic manifestation of exclusion. Similarly, overcoming this sense of exclusion lies at the core of reconciliation, bringing people into the political community. So building up to a deadly conflict in many cases corresponds with a parallel process of exclusion actualized through popular commitments to polarized identities. These identities can be, again, ethnic, religious, ideological. In Kosovo, it really is ethnic identities that form the basis of these exclusive communities. And they define strict boundaries of exclusion that override broader conceptions of an inclusive citizenship. And they create sort of the foundations of a conflict. Overcoming this institutionalized social exclusion would require new institutions that can be constructed in an inclusive manner. I would say one of the key points of inclusion and exclusion is social rights, right? And by social rights, I mean all these sorts of rights of employment, rights of social welfare, rights of pension, of disability funds. And again, we'll go through this again. I I would argue that effective post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation addresses the divisions of these and brings people into an inclusive citizenship. We can conceive of social rights as a kind of public protection from the vagaries of modern life, right? The things that we need protection against because we don't know what's coming. Right? As the Austrian economist Karl Polanyi had eloquently put it, reflecting on his interwar experience in Europe, without the protection of social rights, quote, human beings would simply perish from the effects of social exposure. They would die as victims of acute social dislocation through vice, perversion, crime, and starvation. Many of the problems of the aftermath of a violent conflict easily fit under Polanyi's headings, right? Vice, perversion, crime, and starvation read into contemporary conflict or post-conflict situations, the trafficking of drugs, the trafficking of women and girls, shortages of food, all of the miserableness of the post-conflict life. Rebuilding social institutions, public guarantees against these risks, these deprivations, is the practical and political method for addressing the problems of exclusion. An excluded citizen, though, a citizen who has been excluded, is in some ways deprived of his or her full rights and is subject to gradations, gradations of citizenship, a term from Derek Keeter, a theorist of citizenship. Prior to the international intervention in 1999, for example, Albanians in Yugoslav Kosovo saw their citizenship as degraded compared to their Serbian neighbors. Since 1999, Kosovo Serbs feel their citizenship has been degraded in some way. And so long as these perceptions of exclusion and degradation exist in terms of being a full citizen or a semi-citizen or half a citizen, reconciliation will probably remain elusive in these contexts. But the attention that we give to social exclusion in some ways is very deeply tied to our concern with conditions of poverty. An Irish scholar of social theory and social policy, Fred Powell, would argue that social exclusion refers not only to low consumption, essentially poverty due to material deprivation, but to the inability of the poor to participate fully through exercising their social, cultural, and political rights as citizens. Again, political sciences, so citizens, of course, figures large in my sense of thought here. But Powell further elaborates that social exclusion is a counter-concept to citizenships. It's sort of the anti-citizen that has excluded, the negative. And these exclusions relate directly to deeply divided polities. Citizenship divisions are often based on economic exclusion and translate into or reinforced through other forms of exclusion, race, religion, cultural, ethnic, right? Or sort of generalized theorists, Nancy Fraser, Charles Taylor, who have looked at the ideas of recognition as a right and cultural misrecognition as a basic injustice. I've argued things that a cultural and symbolic injustice, right? Cultural domination, non-recognition, delimit sort of new paradigms of injustice. With these kinds of divisions implicitly important in terms of post-conflict concerns, attention to social policy, which deals directly with these particular aspects, is a natural corollary to dealing with economic disparities, so as that they do not reinforce these cultural, ethnic, racial cleavages that are constituted by misrecognition. Right? Social policy works towards addressing injustices, both in terms of recognition and redistribution. In doing this, in fulfilling these important aspects of citizenship rights, social welfare institutions function as integrative mechanisms. They further social reconciliation by pulling people into the system. It's a core part of many established social policy theorists. Right? One of the longtime theorists, Harold Lewinsky, at the University of Southern California, has argued that the essence of the welfare state, the state built on the social policy, is that government-protected minimum standards of income, nutrition, health and safety, education and housing, assured to every citizen as a social right and not as charity. That this is the essence of the welfare state. Another longtime European theorist of this, Gösta Esper Andersen, has argued that the proposition that social citizen is a core idea of the welfare state, to have a citizenship centered around social rights, comes from T.H. Marshall. Right? T.H. Marshall was a sociologist from mid-century England, and his work really lies at the heart of what we think of in terms of social policy. In Marshall's schema, the citizenship developed over time between a basket of rights and obligations. In general, there were civil, political, and social rights. Civil rights developed in the 18th century, political rights in the 19th century, and social rights were really a product of the 20th century. Marshall, in his very sort of distinctly mid-century British language, had concluded that, quote, the preservation of economic inequalities has been made more difficult by the enrichment of the status of citizenship. In plain English, the extension of social rights made the political differences of class less important, right? For Marshall, class was the central division, right? In terms of religious, ideological, ethnic. In Marshall's, in mid-century England, it was the class divisions that were considered most dangerous to the idea of social economy, or to the idea of a socially stable polity, to the idea of a reconciled polity. And the core idea of all of this is that within this framework, the rebuilding of a just society and the institutions would go with it, including mundane and policy-oriented ideas like social assistance, like pension funds, unemployment, disability insurance, really is the proper realm of reconciliation. In essence, reconciliation is also about very sort of boring topics like pension annuities, like healthcare reform, like these sort of difficulties. But I have to add a bit of a caveat to this. Although social welfare institutions may help towards overcoming divisions in a polity that's been deeply divided, they do not necessarily do that. Right? Social polities are highly differentiated even amongst the most highly developed democratic welfare states. Differentiations of various types of programs relate to the question of post-conflict reconstruction. Because you are, in fact, rebuilding these systems, you need to know how they've worked in other places. They have various outcomes depending on their design. Right? If the institution is going to be expected to deliver long-term integration, it must be designed with that in mind. Social justice, permanency, equality must be core features of the design going into it. If policy planners aim programs to be short-lived, easily transformed, less than permanent, you can also get those. You can also get programs that will become stratifying, right? The U.S. social welfare system is one that's routinely identified as creating stratified divisions within our own social system. So the determination of the type of social welfare regime is very important in terms of how it can achieve a kind of reconciliation, or if it can. Right? In terms of the argument to the practitioners, for the students who are here who plan on going off and being UN officials in the field, rebuilding polities, which I'm sure some of you will, the argument is really that the content of systems, the details of the policy is what is important for achieving these kinds of reconciliations or programs that can achieve reconciliation through broad social policy, right? So if the devil is in the details of social policy are in the content of the programs, the specifics. Some social policy scholars have identified specific policy figurations that are particularly effective at encouraging social solidarity, right? Programs that are universal, highly decommodifying, and designed and implemented with these goals in mind tend to be the most effective. Social policies can create social stratification. Again, there's a negative to this. Poorly designed welfare programs can create social stigma. They can create dependency. Tightly targeted programs in terms of economic or social status can create a stigma of being an aid recipient, right, that people will tend towards avoiding. Similarly, if they're differentiated in terms of particular collective groups, ethnic identities, religious identities, they can also be divisive in those ways. But if we do design them with social justice in mind, they can prove to be effective. If we don't, they will not, regardless, right? So the design, you may not, in fact, get what you want from the design. You may, in the implementation, not work out the way expected to. But if you don't have it in that design, you're certainly not going to get social justice. So it needs to be sort of a core aspect of it. I want to point here to some of the lessons of post-World War II Europe for this particular aspect, right? And the reconciliation of, or the reconstruction and the reconciliation of Europe since World War II. And I think the lessons for this are not necessarily appreciated in terms of the broad sense of post-conflict reconstruction as we think of it in places like Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, like Africa, like Central Asia, and the variety of places that experience these kinds of conflicts. One of the historians of contemporary post-war Europe, Tony Judd, has said, the Second World War transformed the role of the modern state and the expectations placed upon it. Much of the post-war recovery of Western Europe rested on the adaptation of social policies that became the foundations for these welfare states. Coming out of the extreme insecurity of total war, Europeans sought stability and as much guaranteed security as possible. The failures of pre-war liberalism, as well as the total defeat of fascism, challenged post-war policy planners in order to revive democracy and achieve a kind of practical political reconciliation within Europe. Demanded a reordering of the responsibilities between states and citizens. But public commitments to full employment, national health care programs, guaranteed pensions were all promoted as part of an economic recovery and the moral foundation for a democratic and just post-war Europe. Of course, studies extend that there are high financial costs to social welfare, and this is something that recurs in terms of post-conflict reconstruction. Who's going to pay for this? But in post-war Europe, the people of Europe, for the most part, with significant assistance from the Marshall Plan, but people were willing to assume much higher rates of taxation than they had previously experienced. That went along with the much higher spending. And there was a sense of why was this so? And again, return to Tony Judt, so the foundations of popular support for these high levels of spending and the related taxation. The post-war welfare systems were a guarantee, according to Judt, a guarantee of a certain minimum of justness or fairness after the war. Post-war social policy was politically successful despite their expenses because they provided broad benefits across the population. Delivering relief to the very poor, they also delivered benefits to the middle classes, pulled them into the social compact that was this process of reconciliation through social welfare. For Mark Mazauer, another historian of post-war Europe, it was a further instance of the way post-war West European democracy stabilized by the middle classes who turned radical agendas to their own ends, to creating stable and quiet societies in some ways, less dramatic times. These lessons of democratic reconciliation, stabilization through social welfare, I believe are important for more recent post-conflict reconstructions, right, and our efforts to reconcile these more recent violent conflicts. Despite this, they're not often addressed in a comprehensive manner in post-conflict reconstruction. Social policy is either seen as an issue that's better addressed once other policy considerations have been made, or it's regulated to relatively small-scale interventions. Rather than being central to the debate surrounding post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation, public, state-based social welfare policy often drifts from the public discourse. It's left to decision makers who are an interested elite, who are particularly fascinated by social policy, but not necessarily with the democracies that go with them. They're often expatriate experts, right? This is the rise of the international consultant class and their role in creating welfare systems in places that undergo post-conflict. There are tremendous influence in these places, for better or worse, and I would argue mostly for worse. Not that they do bad jobs, but largely because of what sort of comes next in this, the fact that they lock out local political participation, right, and reduce public discussions. What's missing from these public discussions are the social, political, and economic organizations that are historically the moving force behind social policy, right? And the moving source behind social policy traditionally, there's these institutions that could affect reconciliation, are political parties, state agencies, organized labor, organized capital, right? But incorporating these more traditional political actors, these guys like organized labor, organized capital, into social policy process making is a move beyond even some of the more sort of participatory ideas that we have in terms of reconstruction, because it's a return to the political. Right? These are deeply political debates, and is often a bit more contentious than international actors are willing to allow. And it makes sense in the sense that you're be handing over to former combatants intensely political debates and asking them to resolve them after they had just spent a good deal of time essentially fighting over these very same battles, right? So on the practical level, you are going to need international intervention, international assistance. But I do believe that you do need to include these broader actors, these people like trade unions. I can give you the example again in Kosovo. The trade union on the ground in Kosovo was basically marginalized, not because anybody had anything against working with trade unions, but because it didn't occur to any of the international NGOs that a trade union would be a reasonable partner in post-conflict reconstruction. They weren't seen as the kind of actor you would go to. You went to charitable organizations. We worked with, for example, with the Mother Teresa Society, not with the Kosovo Alliance of Workers. Right? But these working class parties, trade unions, have traditionally been the foundation of social welfare. They're the ones who make the deals. Engaging in that political discussion, that political fight, may in fact be something that has to be done in terms of affecting long-term reconciliation. It holds great risks, but I believe that despite these risks, engaging these issues is a great opportunity, though, because it will create, if you can get an agreement from these actors, you can get concrete results in terms of social policies and social programs that will work on the ground. Mediation, hand-holding will be necessary. There's no doubt about it. I'm going to a bit of a conclusion on this. The idea of rebuilding social welfare systems, like I said, is rarely at the top of the agenda when it comes to post-conflict policy, when it comes to ideas of reconciliation. But responses to these kinds of violent conflicts are generally seen as sort of on a continuum. Right? They run from humanitarian assistance to mediation and negotiation to full intervention and finally to reconstruction. This is sort of the general reconstruction paradigm or continuum that people work with. It's a useful bureaucratic tool, but in relating to this broader political struggle that occurs, I think it belies the complicated nature of conflict dynamics and the need to appreciate the political contestation that lies at the heart of conflicts. Disagreements about social policy are actually often at the core of political contestation because they're so important for the nature of what will become the governing regime or had been the previous governing regime. They make up the ongoing local history. They make up all of where the conflicts come from in some sense. And conflicts may appear to have beginnings and ends. There may be a day that the shots were fired when the old regime fell. There may be the signing of the peace accords. But these are really just markers that signify dramatic political change, not devoid of a political vacuum. Right? The first shots may signify the beginning of the conflict, but also the maturation of a violent opposition or the radicalization of what had been a nonviolent opposition. The weak old regime falls marks the turning point of a regime's ability to enforce its will, but not necessarily the destruction of the social, economic, and political forces that had kept it in place. In this sense, peace accords are also the beginning of a long and contentious implementation period rather than the end of the conflict. And in that regard, the historical embeddedness, so to say, of conflicts highlights the importance of social policy. Communities and groups supported through welfare assistance may not seem to be the primary participants in the conflict, but they're not just the bystanders. Right? Going back to the case of Kosovo, for example, rural Albanian families made up the majority of the social assistance roles. They were also the pool from which the most militant fighters were pulled from. They were the core as well of the symbolic Albanian nation in some way. Similarly, elderly rural Serbs who made up the Serbian community's largest welfare recipient group were often the very people that Milosevic and the Serbian national movement claimed to speak for and to be protecting. The fight was not over welfare benefits per se, but it was a struggle of the boundaries of citizenship and the extension of social rights, who was in and who was out. Violations of social rights were as much a part of the original conflict as familiar litanies of violations of civil, political, or human rights. Post-conflict environment, agents of reconstruction, such as international NGOs, the UN, local post-conflict governments, do not start from scratch. They build on earlier struggles, including political struggles over social justice that are often centered on social rights. So social welfare institutions can be a powerful tool for creating the foundation of social solidarity and ultimately reconciliation. What we seem to know about social welfare institutions is that universalists, decommodifying just social policy, create a broad sense of solidarity. They cut across divisions, which led to conflicts. Social policies identified as just by the larger population support political stability, a sense of positive identification with the larger social system. Social welfare institutions provide economic basic for multi-ethnic incorporation. They provide a minimum level of human security. In other words, they can affect the process of long-term reconciliation. They also, again, to bring it to a close in a sense, carry risks Social programs that strongly differentiate on the basis of ethnicity, factors which correlate to ethnicity, can reinforce divisions. They can be perceived as unjust and drive people further apart. I think it's important, though, that we do not ignore the potential positive role of effective social policy. It's possibly one of the most powerful integrative tools available in rebuilding and achieving reconciliation in a post-conflict environment. To ignore the divisive potential of poorly bad designs, conversely, a badly designed or poorly implemented social policy, however, can lay the foundations for violence. And just to stress the idea being that social welfare is a tool that we have that is often ignored. It's put aside. It's not seen as something that we normally use in terms of reconstructing societies. But in fact, it's remarkably powerful. And as any sort of policy tool, it's powerful both for the positive and for the negative. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for a little bit of Q&A session. If you have questions, would you line up at the 2 mics at the sides of the room, please?
Hello, my name is Landon Isbell. I'm a senior here at Idaho, and I want to thank you for coming in. My question is, when you were talking about these social welfare systems, you mentioned the extreme costs that these systems do bring upon the state, and I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on how do you bring like consolidation to two groups that have been separated for so long, especially on something such as a tax policy of how to fund these things?
How you would go about that sort of process is going to involve sort of the classic mediations of negotiation, right? The sort of getting to yes process. And I think in a lot of ways it would be very situational, depending on the context. I think if you can move towards issues of negotiating taxation, for example, you may be laying a foundation for a more lasting peace because it is so fundamental to the functioning of the polity. It's also something that's eminently practical. So in that sense, there is a sense that people will be able to say, okay, this is something we can work on. It doesn't necessarily immediately involve the difficulties of identifying, again, victims or victimizers, of identifying the causes of injustice or the causes of violence. But it's certainly an extraordinarily difficult task. And it's also one that is going to involve lots of technical problems. There may not be the sense of necessarily how you go about taxing in order to achieve the kind of policy you want. But at the same time, I think it is something that does need to be dealt with in a very direct way with the subjects of the reconstruction that you are hoping to see reconciled. Right? I'm not sure if that's a very good answer in the sense that how would you do it? Probably very slowly in a very frustrating manner. But I think it does, the advantage of it is one, that it lays this foundation, right? That you can actually work from a potentially functioning state that has a taxation system that could work. And two, it is something concrete that you can bring parties that have had difficult time dealing with each other to bear on. You could say, look, we're going to talk about tax policy today, not necessarily the sort of grand scheme of, you know, to use the sort of Kosovo example, we're not going to talk about what happened in 1389. We're going to talk about tax policy now. And so there's a sense that it does bring in a kind of focus, but it's going to be particularly contentious and difficult. And it's an aspect that I would want to stress. It's not going to be necessarily very pretty. In Kosovo, for example, international actors tended to avoid those fights. They didn't want to have it. They didn't want to see the local population do it because it was considered to be just more trouble than it's worth. And really, in reality, they thought, look, we're from the European Union, we're from the United States, we know how tax policy works. Here, this will do it, right? There wasn't the sense that this is a political fight that these people should have over their political future. It was a financial technocratic matter. And I think we do have to politicize some of the issues that the international consultant class, to sort of put it in that sense, don't see as political, but in fact are deeply political, right? Taxes are usually political here. Why wouldn't they be political there?
Thank you.
Hi. Could you comment on the role of religious and educational institutions in promoting reconciliation and social welfare? Or do you see them as these institutions as either too epiphenomenal, beside the point, or actually part of the problem rather than the solution?
Okay. I'll respond in a very particular way, just because it's something I'm sort of dealing with to a certain degree. And I'll respond in reference to this post-World War II European context. And in that case, what were essentially religious political parties, the Christian democratic parties, in some ways took the lead on the reconstruction of Europe. And I think the role of religion in those particular parties was in some ways moderating. It created a bit of a safety valve where they could enact relatively positive social policies that were based on ideas of family. And this was always a very important part of Christian democratic rhetoric, was the idea that the family was a very important social institution that needed to be protected. And so you could provide benefits to women with children, all of these other things. And so I think in that sense, there is a political role in providing a moral basis to engage in making social policy decisions that is slightly removed from what may be violent political or a violent political arena. But it's very particular. In terms of the larger sort of role of religion, I think I would leave that aside from my own personal perspective. I think there's a tremendous role for religion, obviously. But in this context, I think where it's useful is in terms of guiding particular political actors to engage in certain policy decisions towards particular policy paradigms, right? In this case, progressive social policies.
Okay, what about education? Like what kind of history gets taught? What kind of literature gets taught? Does this have a role in who this,
And
yeah.
education, of course, a key, and education is a key social right in that regard, right? So it's also something that's going to need to be addressed in those terms. And I think in that regard, there is a sense that you do need a unified set of educational parameters that constitute what is a citizen, right? And of course, my particular interest in education as a social scientist is the social sciences. So I would be most concerned about what you're teaching students as in terms of citizenship, citizenship studies. I don't know if we don't really teach citizenship in the United States so much, right? Maybe we did. We just teach civics at least, And there's a sense that, well, maybe that's a necessary component, teaching citizenship, and maybe it has to be something that is brought down by the state that is not subject to religious vagaries. There may be a component that says even religious schools have to teach this about what it means to be part of our community, our political community. And of course, again, that's very highly contentious, and you can get good and bad, right? Social policy, like I said, all policies to a certain degree are Spider-Man-esque, right? You can use your power for good or you can use your power for bad. And this is also, right? Education policy, the same as social policy. You can use it to be divisive. But I think perhaps that's sort of the role of justice here, is the sense of being able to decide what are better policies by evaluating them in terms of justice. And that would, again, sort of push you back to definitions of justice. And I would fall more towards sort of a Rawlsian idea of justice as fairness, and the conception that what you're looking for in a just society is one that can be conceived of as fair.
Thank you for being here this evening. You've certainly seen conflict around the world. What I'm curious about is if you might have any speculations upon the impact for civic life here in America if, for instance, giving the state of the U.S. Treasury a large deficit and a current impasse in the U.S. government of solving the problems of Medicaid and Social Security. So 20, 30 years out from now, could we be having sort of a internal Kosovo conflict between, say, generation Z+1 and X or Q or whatever?
So is civil war possible in the United States?
Not civil war, but,
but no, I see
a
what you're saying.
considerable level of emotional and social discomfort.
There is, I think, and I think that's part of this sense that we are not so different. This is one of the things I took away from my studies of social policy in Kosovo. We're not so different. What we argue about in terms of social policy, who's in, who's out, who gets benefits, is essentially the same things that are argued in places like Kosovo. So yes, right, if policies are designed in a way that are perceived by a significant portion of society as unjust, then you do run the risk of creating cleavages or reinforcing cleavages that already exist and creating conflict in the longer term. No political system is necessarily permanent, in part because history happens. There's always something coming up over time. So I would say, yes, if we make bad choices in terms of policies, if we can't fix the policies that we have that are perceived by some people as unjust, then yes, we run the risk of, deeper divisions. But on the other hand, if we can look at our own social policies and say, oh, wait a second, there is an injustice here, we can actively fix them. And in a sense, go through the same reconstruction that a post-conflict society goes through, just sort of on a less intense way. And I think that is always a possibility. It is something, in a sense, we're not so different from Kosovo or any place else in that sense. We're all sort of arguing about these sort of same issues. The hermeneutic advantage of a place like Kosovo is it's all very obvious and it's all very dramatic. It's a small place and you can see the impacts almost immediately, but it's not so different.
Hi. Saturday I picked up a book on tapes from the library by John Perkins, Confessions of the Economic Hitman.
Okay.
I was pretty intrigued. The idea is big money coming in to loan to a small country and then they're in debt forever and can't quite pay it back. Is this happening in Kosovo? Have you seen this happen in Guatemala? Is there value to this?
There's definitely, I mean, the critiques of the international financial institutions are pretty well founded in many ways. I'm not an economic development economist, so I can't give you the full details of it all. Kosovo has a marginal advantage in that up until February 17th, it wasn't a state, so it couldn't really borrow. So everything had to be sort of budgeted either by direct grants or paid off. But I think where there's a real lesson for that, in that sense of it, is that, and I'm going to tip my political hand in some ways, which I've probably already tipped to a certain degree, but argue that international capital is well organized. And I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, right? Because you do need these political organizations. But they can employ things like, the international economic hitman is one way to think of it. But they do have influence in the IMF, the World Bank, all of these big institutions. At the grassroots level, there's increasing organization, and that's very good and it's very effective. But also some of the sort of important high-level political actors that went head-to-head against capital to negotiate the great compromises of U.S. history, for example, or the compromises of the post-war period that said, okay, look, workers will get their fair wages and owners will get their profits and there won't be intense class violence. Those actors aren't so effective. The International Labor Organization is a great organization, but it doesn't quite mobilize international labor to demand its rights. And it's not perceived for that to be its job, right? It's doing good work. I wouldn't say the ILO does bad work, but it's not about to organize strikes in some place that sees, the impact of IFI, for example. And there's other institutions or other gaps like that. I don't want to come across as, a Bolshevik, to be blunt. Like, I don't want to see like a throwback of some sort of old Marxist character, some old, communist professor. But there's a value of the idea of an international, so the socialist international, not necessarily as promoting international socialism, but the idea that there was a transnational organization of people who were committed to that particular ideological struggle. And there's not necessarily that counterpoint anymore. But that being said, international finance is still very well organized and very effective for the most part. And in some cases, you do need, you could also argue that without that counterbalance, without workers saying, hey, wait a second, calm down a little bit here, finance will go too far, right? It will, and I mean, this could be what we've seen in terms of the real difficulties that exist in international financial markets right now, is that there aren't the brakes. Because the other side isn't so well organized, and they don't have that sort of transnational presence. Is that a fair answer? Sure. Go ahead.
Wondering if there's a short or medium-term way forward between Serbs in Kosovo and Kosovars in Kosovo, and related to that, Serbians and Kosovars internationally.
Is there a short and medium way forward? Sure. I mean, it revolves really on the political dynamics of the specific places. It will depend to a very large degree on how the next Serbian elections go, who wins for the short and the medium term. Within Kosovo, it will also depend on how they deal with being independent. The ball is really in the court of the Kosovo Albanians in terms of whether or not it's going to be a reasonable place for Serbs to live, for Kosovo Serbs to live, which is the key problem. Is this someplace Kosovo Serbs can feel a part of, right? This is the inclusion-exclusion problem. Are they included? And it's up in the air. What's the way forward in the immediate sense? And this is sort of, I think, come up in the earlier conversation. If Kosovo Albanians, for example, in the Pristina government, allow Serbs to vote in the Serbian elections and recognize the premise of sort of dual citizenship, I think that'll be a good step forward. It'll be an acknowledgement of sort of duality of Serbs and that the Albanians don't feel threatened in that regard. For Serbia itself, my particular political perspective is that the EU is the deciding factor here, and not the EU as being able to decide, but if Serbia decides that it really does see itself as part of the European Union, it will be welcomed into the European Union. It will take a little while, but the European Union wants them in. And if they're willing to make the reforms and do the things that bring them in, that will ultimately create that kind of stability within Serbia that will make it deal with Kosovo in an effective way. If it doesn't, if it decides that, at least for the short term, it doesn't want to be part of the European Union, it doesn't want that direction in its politics, that it chooses essentially to be somewhat blunt, maybe it chooses Russia and the Russian model, then it will continue to be something of what it is, right? A difficult place in the heart of Europe, a place that Europe struggles with because it wants it in but can't quite convince it that this is in its best interests. In the long term, I think it will. Right? I think in the long term, Serbia will become Europe in that regard, and Kosovo will certainly. Right? This is their stated goal, and they're an odd place, Kosovo, in their way, but they have an incredible sense of perseverance, and they tend to move towards what they've decided politically. So I think they will end up, along with Albania and Macedonia, at some point within the European Union, and moving in that sort of general European direction.
What I'm interested in is how any of this might apply to the Iraq model. When you talked about certain elements of a society being marginalized post-conflict, pre-conflict. The Sunnis are in, the Shia are out, the Kurds are always out. Now the Sunni are out and the Shias are in. What you talk about as a solution for Kosovo almost sounds like you think that Iraq should be divided into 3 countries, or that model would indicate that we should have separate ethnic groups. What you have in what the United States calls post-conflict Iraq is probably all 3 elements of that country actively working against reconciliation by using violence to not allow reconciliation to happen. So could you comment on that situation and what lessons something like the Balkans would teach us in Iraq?
Sure. You know, full disclosure, I'm not an Iraqi expert, and so I'm willing to sort of comment on it in terms of conflict, but I'm not, you know, someone who knows deeply the history of Iraq. In terms of conflict, and I think this is somewhat of the problem here in terms of the presentation in terms of Iraq is it's really not post-conflict. If you asked me how I would deal with Iraq overall, I would say yes, it is either in the process of spinning apart into its constituent elements, right, or it has. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the definite solution for Iraq, or that it has to be that way. I don't think it's gone so far to the point, this is again, because I don't know deeply Iraq, but my impression is I don't think it's gone so far to the point that it has to be divided, or that is the likely political outcome. I would, and I guess this is sort of the lesson I would take from the Balkans, is that in order to deal with Iraq, and this is again, if whoever gets elected were to call me and ask me, what do you think? This is what I would say. It would be, you are going to have to organize almost a Balkan-type peace conference. You're going to have to recognize that a comprehensive settlement needs to be made. But it's a particularly difficult one for us because what we would have to recognize is that we are now a party to the conflict. Whereas, in the Dayton Accords, for example, we could act more or less as a mediator. Yeah, we had played favorites. We preferred the Bosnians and the Croats. But on the other hand, it was clear that we were willing to deal with the Serbs. Milosevic was clearly thinking, yes, he can cut a deal with us. And we thought, okay, we can cut a deal with him. We were still a little bit of an outside arbitrator. I don't think we have that position in Iraq. I think maybe the Europeans do, maybe some other actor does, and may be able to pull that sort of comprehensive solution together, and we could support it. We should, for example, maybe pay for it. But I don't think we could do it. And I think until you get to that, you can't get to the ideas of how do you create a just society in post-war Iraq, because I'm not convinced we're at post-war Iraq yet. I think we're still sort of in the middle of it. Similarly with Afghanistan to a certain degree. Afghanistan's probably closer to post-war than Iraq is, but the war's not over as far as I can tell. So, sorry. Good.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could compare for me a social system politically versus a democracy politically, because I understand your argument economically for it, but how, if it's left in the hands of sort of the elite to make the policy decisions, how does that represent the minority better than a democracy would?
Well, it doesn't. And I mean, that's a big part of this. We're not actually operating on democratic principles in many cases when we enact these sort of post-conflict models. There is, at the base of it, right, within the Kosovo mission, for example, from 1999 to, February 17th when Kosovo declared independence, and even more or less after, fundamentally an undemocratic foundation that says that the Secretary General right, the special representative, the Secretary General, has final say over policy matters. The same thing in Bosnia, the High Representative, right? Of course, he had a nicer title than Special Representative of the Secretary General. He was the High Representative. But he also is effectively one of the think tanks of Europe called it the European Raj, in the sense that it was an exercise of, not really democratic practice. And even more fundamentally, the sense of bringing in these sort of international experts, this international consultant class to a very large degree, is not democratic. And so I can give you the example, it had come up in a discussion earlier about pension funds in Kosovo. The pension fund was designed essentially by the U.S. Agency for International Development, by a consultant from them, and it was considered to be simply too complicated to hand over to the elected representatives of Kosovo. In fact, the election had happened, but the government hadn't taken place. It was going to be the provisional institution of self-government, so it was temporary. But they were effectively going to govern the place, but it was felt that this was just too complicated for them, and it was too contentious. So what they would do was they had drafted the law after the election, but before they had actually taken office. Drafted the law and had the special representative sign it into law, and just left one small part for the legislature to sort of agree upon afterwards. That's how the pension got passed. Because it's just, in this instance, it's just too much for these people. The truth is it was a very complicated process, right? And, but on the other hand, pensions are complicated, but everybody seems to figure them out. I'm sure they could have done it. It would have been a pretty nasty fight if they had understood the long-term impacts, and I think they did. I interviewed the first minister of social welfare, and I said, what kind of welfare system do you want? And he said, I want one like Sweden. Of course, who doesn't, right? But we don't really, because we could get one like that if that's what we decided politically. And he knows the difference between a Swedish welfare system and an American system, right? He has family in Staten Island, New York, and he has family in Sweden, right? This is a transnational community in that sense. But they didn't have that say. So you're right, the democratic process is missing in that regard. And partly it's because, when we go into post-conflict situations, democracy is pretty scary, right? You're asking people who really went to war with each other to debate political issues in a nonviolent way. But it is possible, right? It can be done. So I think we need to engage it a little bit more.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.